Hey everyone, we are back with another Know Your Options bonus episode, and this is a new addition to our original series. We're going to be talking all about inductions. So, if you've been listening to the last 7 episodes, you've gotten to know our course instructor, Stephanie Spitzer Hanks, pretty well by now, but I'm excited to have her on today, and she can tell you a little bit more about her since it's been a few years since we recorded a new one of these episodes. So, Stephanie, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I moved from Austin to Waco, and that's been a big adjustment. I've been doing some less doula work and more like doing education, working with this course and working with some people locally. So that's been good. Yeah, COVID and homeschooling and it's all a lot, but and being in a new city and trying to figure out the birth scene in a new place has been kind of fun and interesting, and trying to make connections with people here. It's a whole different scene, and it just sort of reminded me, like, our listeners are all over the nation and all over the world, and how different it can be, even just from one town to the next. How the assumptions and the culture of birth is different. It's been interesting to kind of experience that firsthand.
Definitely. And I think one thing that's different from when we first recorded these is now we have hundreds of students enrolled in the course. So it's been cool to see people go through the content of our course and then get to know them both in the Facebook group. And now with COVID, we started these bi-weekly Zoom calls, and those have been so fun to just see all the, pregnant mamas, and then they come back with their babies and share their birth stories. And it's just been really like a light in my life during this crazy time stuck at home.
Same, absolutely the same for me, because I have really looked forward to those calls, and and we just have a handful of people that usually show up, and a lot of times it's the same folks from one week to the next, and yeah, getting to kind of see them make this progress. It's been great to have that kind of personal connection with our students, because a lot of times we don't really know who they are, and so it's been
Right.
really awesome to get to know a few of them.
Yeah, so through, getting to know our students and just discussions within the group and everything, I think a couple things have been coming up a lot more lately, which is why we wanted to add a couple episodes to this series. So we're going to be doing one about coronavirus, and I know that's probably one people are very anxious to hear, because it's definitely a wrench in your birth plan that you weren't planning. But today we're going to be talking about induction, and this is covered pretty extensively in the course, but not something that we covered in our bonus series the first time around. So I know that you felt pretty strongly about adding this to the lineup, so I'm excited to cover this today with you.
Yeah, there's been some new research that's come out even in the last a couple of years since we put the course together. And so, yeah, I wanted to kind of highlight some of that, and just kind of talk about how inductions work and give people some tips, and, talk about it.
All right. Well, I'm going to start off with, some of the more common questions that we get, and then we'll just kind of go from there and see how the conversation goes. But first off, I want to know what the difference is between an elective induction versus a medically indicated one, and when it's considered medically necessary.
Yeah, and this is definitely something I cover a lot in the course and give, lots of examples about, because I feel like there's a lot of confusion around this with people, because their doctor may say, hey, we need to get scheduled for an induction. You're 38 weeks now. Let's schedule your induction for 39 weeks, for 40 weeks, for 41 weeks, and people think, oh, this must be something that's medically indicated for me. But in reality, that's considered an elective induction. If it's just because of the calendar, then it's elective for the most part, because a medically indicated induction is going to be is for a specific complication that you have developed. So really common ones are, a lot of times people are induced for preeclampsia. It's a really super common one, where their blood pressure has been going up. They've tested protein in their urine. There are things that are indicating that, there's a medical complication that could be resolved by having the baby sooner rather than later. So that's one example. Sometimes inductions happen for gestational diabetes that's not well controlled. Another one that comes up fairly commonly is what's called IUGR, intrauterine growth restriction, where the baby has been, the baby for whatever reason has not been thriving in the womb. And so it's a medical indication that the baby would do better being born sooner rather than later and not waiting for spontaneous labor. Those are the major medical indications. There can be some other ones that would be less common that could come up. But that's the difference between, you having complications, symptoms of something that is threatening the health of, the birthing person or the baby. So that's a medically indicated induction. And an elective induction can be at any point. Really, it's more for convenience. Sometimes, there's some, like I said, there's been some new studies that have come out that might show some benefit to electively inducing at 39 weeks or at 41 weeks. And we can talk more about those studies in a bit if you want. But so there's some indication that it can be a reasonable thing for somebody to choose to induce at any point from 39 weeks on, but that's still considered elective because you're choosing to do it based on your own kind of ability to tolerate risk and comfort level, but not because there's a medical complication that's developed.
Yeah, so I feel like, it used to be pretty commonly understood that 42 weeks, like anything past 42 weeks was considered post-dates. And so is that still a safe, amount of time to be pregnant? And can you go past 41 weeks? I feel like you don't hear that as much anymore. And I'm speaking from someone who definitely went to 42 weeks twice. So
right. And I myself went past 41 weeks with one of my babies. But yeah, like I said, there's been some more research that's been coming out and some more analyses that have been coming out in the last couple of years. And what it really comes down to is risk of stillbirth, and that does start to creep up after 41 weeks. It's still a very low number, and a lot of people would still be totally comfortable waiting until 42 weeks. And really, after 42 weeks, if you kind of crunch the numbers and look statistically, so after 42 weeks, the risk of stillbirth or other kinds of complications really do start to jump, and pretty much nobody's comfortable as a care provider and as a pregnant person comfortable going past 42 weeks just because those statistics start to look a little bit scary. And, and most people will go into labor by 42 weeks. Like it's pretty uncommon to still be pregnant at 42 weeks, even without, the higher incidence of induction. But there's been some research that's come out that says, at 41 weeks, those numbers do start to drift up. And so for some people, that's not going to be a tolerable level of risk. And so it really needs to be something that is explained to people. Like, here are the numbers. This is what our most recent research indicates. What would you like to do? Because it's still a person's choice to have an induction or not at 41 weeks. Just like everything to do with your body, it's your choice whether you want to accept the recommendation to induce or not. And that's one of the things that we talk about a lot in the course is asking good questions and understanding what your rights are, and understanding that your own personal goals and preferences really ought to be taken into account when making this kind of shared decision making with your care provider.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that when you talk about, the numbers creeping up and the level of risk increasing, it's still a pretty low number.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So the risk of stillbirth, it does rise gradually from 39 weeks onward. And then it starts to increase, a little bit more rapidly starting at 41 weeks. So here's the numbers. So at 39 weeks, it's 4 stillbirths per 10,000 births. And then at 40 weeks, that number goes from 4 to 7 per 10,000. And then at 41 weeks, it does go up to 17 per 10,000 births. And then at 42 weeks, it jumps to 32. So again, the number going from 40 to 41 was 7 to 17. So that's 10 more stillbirths, 10 out of 10,000.
Right.
So it's a really massive number, and it's kind of hard to consider any number of stillbirths being acceptable. And so that's kind of where most people kind of get caught up. But when you look at just the vast number that is 10,000, it's still a really tiny percentage.
Right. And the fact that just being pregnant comes with risk. And so if you're pregnant longer, there's more risk potentially.
For sure. And, and most care providers are doing an increased level of what's called expectant management, where they're doing more, maybe more growth scans, more, coming in and checking your blood pressure, coming in and checking, what's going on, the non-stress test with the, counting the kicks and all of those things. There can be any number of tests and measures done to try to measure whether things are staying healthy. And I think for a lot of people, it does matter where you're giving birth, because if you were already planning to be in the hospital for your birth, then, choosing an induction is a change from a spontaneous labor, but it's not the giant change that it would be if you were planning a community birth. If you're planning to give it birth at home or at a birth center, and then choosing to be admitted into a hospital for an induction, that's a really giant change in your birth plan. And so that, again, is where a person's kind of preferences and values, because if you really highly value giving birth outside of the hospital, then, a slight increase in stillbirth risk may not be big enough for you to change your mind about where you want to give birth.
So because of these new studies, I feel like I'm hearing more medical providers that are recommending elective inductions as early as 39 weeks. So is it just the reason behind it is just the fact that it's less percentage of stillbirth, or is there anything else to that?
Yeah, there is the 39 weeks kind of came along with a study called the ARRIVE study. It came out in the last few years. And one of the things that came out of that study was that it could be that your risk of cesarean is reduced if you are induced at 39 weeks versus waiting for spontaneous labor later on. And the risk did go down a number of percentage points. It wasn't a giant reduction, but there was a reduction in the risk of cesarean in this large study that was done called the ARRIVE study. Again, there are other ways of reducing the risk of cesarean, like giving birth, under the care of a midwife, or giving birth under the care of a midwife outside of a hospital. Like, they have extremely low cesarean rates to begin with. So it does matter kind of who you're giving birth with and, where you're giving birth. Also, hiring a doula has been shown to reduce the incidence of cesarean. So there are a number of ways to lower that risk. So being induced is not the only way to reduce your risk of cesarean. But that's part of what this one particular study seemed to show. And so that's why we hear more recommendations to do inductions at 39 weeks.
All right. So it sounds like this is a relatively new study, you said?
Yes.
Last couple of years. And it's just kind of throwing me for a loop, because I feel like everything I've always heard involves induction kind of leading to a cesarean, sometimes with the cascade of interventions and, tolerating the pain with Pitocin, results in an epidural and all these things. So what's your take on that? Do you feel like, have you seen this really reducing cesareans in your practice as a doula or from other doulas Like, do you recommend it? Would you recommend it to a client to get induced at 39 weeks? What's your hot take?
What's my hot take? Yeah, no, I would definitely talk to people, and I do talk to people about it, because, if their OB brings it up and they're totally blindsided, they won't really know what it means. And one of the really good places to go to read up about this is evidencebasedbirth.com/ARRIVE, because the name of the trial was the ARRIVE trial. And so you can kind of read a little bit there about it. There's other places on the internet you can look. But, bottom line is that, this is a pretty big study, but whether we can apply the results to every hospital, in North America and other places is a big question mark, because it could be that because these hospitals were participating in the study, that they followed this one particular induction protocol. I mean, because induction protocols can really vary from one place to the next. So it could be that because they were participating in the study and following this one protocol, that reduced, resulted in a lower rate of cesarean. May also be just because they were part of the study, because when people know that they're being watched, they tend to do better, if you know what I mean? They tend to follow the rules a little more closely. And so, that might have fed into it. I mean, it's a pretty big study, but it's one study, and it may not be able to be applied to other places who aren't following the same protocol. So I tell people about it because I want them to know that this is something that's out there and that OBs are reading. But it's not necessarily the only way to reduce your risk of cesarean. There are several other ways to reduce your risk of cesarean. So if being induced at 39 weeks does not necessarily appeal to you, this is not the only way to reduce your cesarean rate, is sort of my hot take right there.
Okay. All right. So do you think that induction is on the rise right now due to COVID-19?
Yeah, I've heard different things. It's been really interesting just having our ear to people giving birth all over the country due to, our course being, our students being all over the place, because there's kind of two different ways to think about it. So inductions do require you to stay in the hospital for much longer on average than a spontaneous labor. And so being in the hospital and having, more exposure time there, is something that some people really want to avoid. And so being induced in a time of COVID, it would seem like there would be fewer inductions. Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, some people are being asked to come in and be induced. And I think just to kind of control things a little bit more, because both with inductions and cesareans, those are planned interventions and planned procedures. And so as with any other planned procedure in the hospital, people are going to be able to go in and be tested for COVID, a couple of days before.
Right.
So that, your status is known when you show up for your planned procedure. And so then, as opposed to showing up in spontaneous labor and needing to do a rapid test and, the question marks around that and the time delay and knowing what your results are while you're in labor. I mean, none of that is ideal either. So I think there is sort of an attractive thing about knowing your status before your labor is induced. Also, I've heard that some doctors don't coming from clinic, across the street to attend your birth and then going back to clinic, because that's, kind of coming in and out of the hospital, and going back to clinic is, unnecessary exposure. So it may be that people are wanting to do more inductions so that when your care provider is going to be there. And that's always a reason that some people want to do inductions, because they want to have their care provider there. So that may be less likely even now with COVID because of people not being able to come back and forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I'm like you. I feel like I've just kind of heard it all over the board as far as, and it's been like that since the beginning. Each hospital's handling things differently, and hopefully it'll level out here in a bit, and I'll definitely be interested to see, studies and statistics a year from now. So on this note, whether you are induced or not, but if you are, what are some things that our listeners should know about just how to prepare for their induction so that it is, as smooth as possible?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things for people to understand about inductions is that they are long. You're there from before your first contraction, so it can be easily 24 hours or longer. Mm-hmm. And it does depend on whether you've given birth before vaginally, because if you've had a prior vaginal birth, then inductions typically don't take as long to get started. But if you've never been induced before, you've never given birth before, then we really have to do a lot of convincing to get your body to go into labor. And so often it's staying, often it's checking in the evening and then doing a lot of what's called cervical ripening overnight, and not even really starting in with trying to induce contractions until the next day. And then depending on how all of those factors go, I mean, it can be delayed. It can take it can take days longer than people anticipate sometimes. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to say it was, 36, 48 hours for my induction. Mm-hmm. So that whole time you're not in labor, but you're in the hospital, and it's uncomfortable because the bed's not comfortable, because the room's not comfortable. So I really recommend people try bringing in comfort items with them. So bringing in your own blanket, bring your own pillows. Bring your diffuser with your essential oils, bring your speakers and have some music, bring your laptop so you have something to do, so string up twinkly lights, bring in some framed pictures of, your other kids or your dog or, whatever that brings you joy and that you like to look at. So really trying to make sure that you have all your comfort items with you, and, not to feel like self-conscious about that. Cause I've seen people like bring in giant rolling suitcases and like really making themselves at home, because you honestly don't know how long you're going to be there.
Yeah, especially now too, because I know some of the policies around COVID are once you get in that room, you cannot leave to go get things from home or out of the car or whatever. So pack it all in.
Bring it all in, and bring plenty of food and snacks, for you, because I do encourage people to eat and drink during labor, but also for your support person needs to have plenty of things to eat and snack on, because it could be a long, long time, and you may not be able to bring food in.
Right.
Depending. This is one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about our COVID one is, right, how to prepare for giving birth under COVID. But right, just bringing it all in. Bring it all in and make yourself at home.
Yeah.
I would say also like really being familiar with, what is the protocol that your care provider recommends for induction? How do they want to get your cervix ready? Because there's various methods that can be used. And so, you might want to know what those are. And we do definitely talk about that in the course. Mm-hmm. Like, what are the different ways and which one might you prefer to use? And so you really want to talk that through with your care provider before you show up to the hospital. Talk about that in the appointment in the office. Like, walk me through this. What kind of interventions are you planning to use? And how will you know when it's time to move to the next one? Will it be possible for me to take a break from the Pitocin if it gets to be too much? What are your thoughts on that? So there's a lot of questions that you can ask about what it's going to look like. I always, believe that knowledge is power, and knowing what to expect is a good way to reduce your anxiety about something that's unknown. So ask lots of questions and make sure that you're on board with the protocol that your care provider has in mind, because they all kind of have their own kind of go-to. So they'll be able to tell you what it is.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for covering all of this. And like you mentioned, we go into depth on induction and coping during induction and all that kind of stuff in the course. So people can find that at thebirthhour.com/course. And then the next bonus episode that we're going to be doing will be all about COVID-19 and what to expect and kind of how to prepare during this crazy time. That's what I'm just calling it now, right? The crazy times.
This shifting landscape. I mean, who even knows what? There's a lot that changes all the time. So we will talk about kind of how to know what to expect and make the best of it.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that discussion today about inductions, and we'll be back next week with that COVID-19 discussion. If you want to go ahead and sign up for the course today, you can do that at thebirthhour.com/course. And right now you can use the coupon code 100OFF for $100 off your enrollment. Again, that's thebirthhour.com/course, and we'll see you next week.